The briefing room fell silent when she walked in. Not the respectful kind of silence that greets a decorated officer, but the awkward, confused silence that happens when someone shows up to a place they supposedly don't belong. Rear Admiral Marcus Kine didn't even look up from his tactical display when the door clicked shut. He was too focused on the holographic projection of the contested airspace over the Callion Strait, where three carrier strike groups converged in what intelligence called the most volatile powder keg since the Cuban Missile Crisis. His briefing team, all men, all seasoned combat veterans, shifted uncomfortably as the woman in the flight suit moved to the back of the room. She didn't announce herself, didn't salute, just stood there with her helmet tucked under one arm, her expression unreadable beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. Someone coughed. Another officer whispered something that might have been a joke. Kine finally glanced up, his steel-gray eyes sweeping across her insignia with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd spent 30 years evaluating personnel in seconds. "You lost, Lieutenant." His voice carried the weight of command but also something else: dismissal. "No, sir. Requested presence at Tactical Briefing 0700, Carrier Air Wing 14. Her voice was steady, almost bored. Kine exchanged glances with his operations officer, a grizzled captain who looked like he'd been carved from granite and disappointment. The Admiral's jaw worked for a moment before he spoke again. "This is a briefing for combat-ready strike package leaders. Deep penetration missions against advanced integrated air defense systems. Are you certain you're in the right room?" "Yes, sir." Something flickered across Kine's face. Not quite annoyance, not quite curiosity. He scrolled through his tablet with one thick finger squinting at the screen. "Your personnel file says you've been flying transport missions for the past 18 months. Humanitarian relief. Cargo runs to Allied bases. Very noble work." The pause before noble spoke volumes. "That's correct, sir." "So explain to me why Command thinks you belong in a strike package briefing when we're 72 hours from potential engagement with a near-peer adversary." He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. Several officers smirked. "Hell, while you're at it, remind me of your call sign. I like to know who I'm working with." She met his gaze without flinching. The room seemed to hold its breath. "Iron Widow, sir." The smirk vanished from Kine's face. Not slowly, it dropped like someone had cut its strings. His arms unfolded. The operations captain beside him actually stepped backward, his chair scraping against the floor. Across the room, a young lieutenant's tablet clattered onto the table. Everyone was staring now, but the quality of their attention had fundamentally changed. Kine's mouth opened slightly, then closed. When he spoke again, his voice had lost every trace of condescension. "Jesus Christ, you're her." The legend of Iron Widow wasn't written in official records. The Navy doesn't publicize the kind of operations that earn a call sign like that. Operations that happen in the spaces between diplomacy and declared war, where plausible deniability is worth more than medals. But in ready rooms across the fleet, in the quiet hours between missions when pilots gathered and old stories were currency, everyone knew the name. Captain Vivienne, Iron Widow. Thorne hadn't always been Iron Widow. 6 years ago, she'd been Viper, a standard-issue aggressive call sign for a standard-issue aggressive pilot fresh out of Top Gun. Sharp reflexes, sharper instincts, and the kind of competitive fire that made her dangerous in the air and exhausting on the ground. She'd flown FA-18 Super Hornets off the USS Theodore Roosevelt, racking up training hours and qualifications with mechanical precision. Her squadron mates respected her flying but kept their distance. She didn't drink with them, didn't trade stories, just flew, studied, and disappeared to her quarters. Then came Operation Smoking Mirror. The details were classified at levels that made grown intelligence officers nervous, but the outline was simple enough. A downed CIA reconnaissance team in the mountains of northern Barakistan, 30 miles behind enemy lines. The terrain was a nightmare of radar-guided anti-aircraft systems and mobile SAM launchers that had already claimed 2 rescue helicopters. The team had intelligence that couldn't fall into enemy hands. Names, networks, operational details that would unravel 5 years of covert work and get dozens of Allied assets killed. Washington had given them 24 hours before authorizing a surgical strike to eliminate the team and their intelligence cache. It was the math of modern warfare. Sacrifice 4 to save 40. Lieutenant Vivian Thorne, squadron commander, had stood in front of his assembled pilots and asked for volunteers. Not ordered, asked, because this was the kind of mission where volunteer was just a polite word for suicide run. The enemy had integrated air defenses that would light up any aircraft within 20 miles. Even if someone got through, extraction meant landing in a hot zone under fire, loading casualties, and flying out through the same kill box. The odds were bad enough that command had already drafted the condolence letters. Every pilot in that room understood what volunteering meant. Most of them had families. All of them had futures. Vivienne had raised her hand first. Her wingman, a pilot named Derek Vance, who everyone called Slash, had stared at her like she'd grown a second head. They weren't friends exactly, but they'd trained together, flown together, trusted each other in the precise mechanical way that military partnerships required. He'd opened his mouth to say something, probably to talk her out of it, but she'd already turned away. Already walking toward the mission planning table, where their squadron commander stood with maps and satellite imagery, and the kind of expression that said he'd hoped no one would volunteer. "Viper," he'd said quietly, "you understand what you're signing up for." "Yes, sir." "You don't have to do this, we can." "With respect, sir, those men don't have 24 hours. She tapped the map where the team's last known position was marked with red. SAR helicopters can't get in. Fast movers can't land. That leaves the Super Hornet. We go in low and fast, use terrain masking to avoid radar, and we have maybe a 10% chance. 10%, the commander's voice was flat. Better than zero, sir. Slash had volunteered seconds later. Then another pilot called Hawk, a veteran with more combat hours than most of the squadron combined. They'd planned the mission with the methodical intensity of people who knew they probably weren't coming back. 3 aircraft. One would provide top cover and electronic warfare support, jamming enemy radar at critical moments. The other 2 would go in, Viper in the lead, because she had the best low-altitude flying scores in the squadron, and Slash as backup in case things went sideways. They'd launched at 0300 under a moonless sky. The flight toward the mountains was pure discipline. No radio chatter except essential brevity codes. No lights except the dim red glow of the instrument panels. Vivienne kept her Super Hornet 50 feet off the deck, following valleys and riverbeds with the kind of precision that turned flying into meditation. At that altitude, one mistake meant hitting a hillside at 500 knots. No warning. No ejection. Just a fireball and another quiet funeral with a closed casket. Her radar warning receiver stayed mostly quiet as they skimmed beneath the enemy's search pattern, but she could feel the threat. The air itself seemed hostile, pressing against the aircraft like invisible hands. She'd studied the enemy's radar coverage for 6 hours straight, memorizing the gaps, the dead zones, the 3-second windows where terrain blocked their sensors. Now she was threading through those windows in real time, banking hard around ridges, pulling up just enough to clear power lines, then dropping back to nap-of-the-earth altitude where the darkness swallowed everything. Widow 2 status. Her voice was calm in the radio. They'd switched her call sign for this mission. Operational security demanded rotating identifiers, but Slash had heard the edge underneath. 2's good, holding formation. Mother Hen has radar contacts bearing 270, 20 miles out. Mobile Sam battery on the move. Copy, stay with me. The extraction point was a dried riverbed barely wide enough for a Super Hornet's wingspan. Intelligence said the reconnaissance team would mark their position with an infrared strobe visible only through night vision. Intelligence also said the enemy had patrols within 3 kilometers. What intelligence couldn't say was whether those patrols had already found the team, whether they were walking into an ambush, whether this entire mission was already compromised. Vivienne pushed those thoughts aside. Fear was a luxury she couldn't afford at 50 feet and 500 knots. The mountains rose ahead like the teeth of some massive predator. She threaded between 2 peaks, felt the aircraft shudder in the turbulence, and dropped into the valley beyond. Her night vision display painted the landscape in shades of green and black: rocks, scattered trees, the serpentine curve of the riverbed, and there, 200 meters ahead, a blinking infrared light. "Contact, I have the strobe." She pulled back on the stick, killing airspeed so hard her body strained against the harness. The Super Hornet wasn't designed for landing on unimproved surfaces, but necessity made all things possible. Her landing gear touched down in a spray of dust and gravel. She killed the engines before the aircraft had fully stopped, already releasing her harness, already moving. 4 figures ran from the rocks. 3 were limping. All carried weapons and the hollow-eyed look of men who'd accepted death and were now being offered an impossible reprieve. Loading the team took 40 seconds that felt like 40 years. The reconnaissance team leader, a man called Reaper whose actual name she never learned, was missing half his left arm. Field bandages had stopped the bleeding, but his face was the color of old paper. 2 others were mobile despite injuries. The 4th was unconscious, carried between his teammates like a sack of equipment that happened to be human. "Can't take 4+ gear," Vivienne said. Her voice was steady despite her racing heart. "Super Hornet's a single-seater. Already pushed max takeoff weight with the fuel load I need to get out. Someone stays." The team leader looked at her with eyes that had seen too much. "Then I stay. Get my boys out." "Negative. You're the intelligence asset. You're the one Washington wants." She pointed at the unconscious man. "He stays. Give him water, morphine, and coordinates for a secondary extraction. SAR will come back for him when we clear the air defenses." "He won't last." "He won't last at all if we're too heavy to clear the ridgeline and crash on takeoff. This is triage, Reaper. You know the math." She was already stripping gear from the unconscious man, creating space. "Slash, you take 2. I'll take Reaper and 1 other. Load up now." They didn't argue. Couldn't argue. In 30 seconds, the wounded reconnaissance team was divided between 2 Super Hornets in configurations that would make any flight safety officer have a stroke. Reaper squeezed into the space behind Vivienne's ejection seat, where electronics and life support systems usually lived. Another man, younger, with shrapnel scars across his face, wedged himself into a compartment that wasn't designed for human occupation. The geometry was impossible, the weight distribution all wrong, but impossible was just a different kind of problem to solve. Vivienne fired up the engines. The Super Hornet screamed in protest at the excessive weight. Her takeoff roll ate up the entire riverbed, every meter bringing them closer to the rocks at the far end. She pulled back on the stick and felt the aircraft struggle, felt it resist, felt it finally, reluctantly, claw its way into the air with maybe 10 feet of clearance to spare. "Widow 2, you're airborne. Good takeoff." "Copy, climbing 2. Her radar warning receiver exploded with noise. Multiple threats. Search radar had found them. The enemy knew they were here. Tracking radar is different from search radar. Search radar is the sweep of a lighthouse beam, looking for something in the darkness. Tracking radar is the predator's eyes locked onto prey, calculating firing solutions and optimal kill zones. Vivienne's threat display lit up like a Christmas tree. SA-15 Gauntlet System, mobile launcher, already computing her trajectory and velocity. The missile was in the air before her warning system finished identifying the threat. Widow 1, defending. She threw the Super Hornet into a hard brake turn, ignoring the screams from the cargo, from the men crammed into spaces never meant for human bodies. G-forces crushed them as she dispensed chaff and flares, trying to break the missile's lock. The radar-guided weapon adjusted course, its seeker head implacable and patient. She pulled harder, feeling the airframe groan. The men in her aircraft weren't strapped in properly, weren't secured, were probably getting pulverized by forces their bodies weren't equipped to handle. But dead from G-forces was better than dead from a surface-to-air missile. The first missile passed behind her by maybe 30 meters, proximity fuse failing to detonate. Pure luck. The second missile launched immediately after. The enemy knew what they were doing. Bracket the target with multiple launches, saturate defensive systems, ensure the kill. Vivienne jinked left, then hard right, putting the Super Hornet through maneuvers that bordered on reckless. Her airspeed was bleeding off dangerously. At these weights and altitudes, she was already outside the performance envelope. One more aggressive turn might stall the aircraft. She turned anyway. The second missile streaked past where she would have been. Her chaff clouds bloomed across the night sky, and then Slash's voice cut through the chaos. Widow 1 splashed that SAM sight, engaging. Negative, you're loaded with. Already committed, get your people home. She wanted to argue, wanted to order him to disengage. But Slash had already rolled inverted and was diving toward the SAM battery that was tracking both of them. His Super Hornet screamed downward, carrying wounded men and enough ordnance to qualify as a war crime if things went wrong. He pickled off 2 AGM-88 HARM anti-radiation missiles, weapons that homed in on enemy radar emissions, and banked hard to avoid ground fire. The explosions on the ground were brief and bright. The SAM battery went silent. But the enemy had more batteries, always more batteries. Vivienne was already climbing, already running, pushing her struggling aircraft toward safer altitude. Her fuel state was critical. Her passengers were probably unconscious from GLOC or pain. And somewhere behind her, Slash was still in the fight, still drawing fire, still buying her seconds with his own life on the table. Widow 2 status. Silence. Slash status check. More silence. Then static washed and distant. 2's hit. Hydraulic failure, can't maintain. Losing altitude. Shit. His transponder disappeared from her display. Vivienne didn't remember the flight back. Later, when intelligence officers asked for her debrief, whole sections of time were just gone, deleted by stress and exhaustion, and the brain's merciful refusal to process everything at once. She remembered crossing the border, remembered the aerial refueling tanker that met her at the emergency rendezvous point. Remembered the tanker crew's shocked silence when they saw her aircraft, battle-damaged, overloaded, flying with a wounded man literally duct-taped into a non-existent crew station. The landing on the carrier was barely controlled crash. Her Super Hornet hit the deck too fast, caught the 3-wire instead of the optimal 3-wire, and damn near tore the arresting gear off the ship. When she finally shut down the engines, her hands were shaking so badly she couldn't release her harness. The deck crew had to help her out, had to practically carry her away while corpsmen swarmed the aircraft to extract Reaper and his teammate. Both reconnaissance members in her aircraft survived. The 2 in Slash's aircraft survived. They'd ejected when his hydraulic systems failed and were recovered 12 hours later by a SAR team. The man they'd left behind in the riverbed was retrieved 3 days later when a follow-up operation cleared the area. He was in rough shape, but alive. Slash's body was never recovered. The Navy gave Vivienne a Distinguished Flying Cross in a ceremony she barely attended. Her squadron mates tried to celebrate with her, tried to pull her into their rituals of coping and grief and dark humor that made the losses bearable. She'd smiled politely and excused herself, went back to her quarters, stared at the wall and saw Slash's Super Hornet disappearing from her radar display over and over and over. The nightmare started a week later. Not the spectacular kind, no explosions or crashes, just small things. The sound of Slash's voice cutting out mid-transmission, the empty chair where he used to sit during mission briefings, the way her hands wouldn't stop shaking when she tried to fill out paperwork. She'd wake up at 3 in the morning certain she could hear his radar warning receiver screaming, certain she'd missed something, failed to act fast enough, made some microscopic error that had killed him. Her flight surgeon prescribed sleeping pills. They didn't help. Her commander suggested counseling. She went to 3 sessions and lied through all of them, said she was fine, said she was processing it, said all the right things that would keep her flight status current. She was rotated stateside for what command called recovery and evaluation. What they meant was, we're not sure if you're broken. She spent 6 months at an administrative post, flying a desk, processing paperwork, slowly suffocating under the weight of normalcy. Every morning she'd wake up and not be in a ready room, not be walking toward her aircraft, not be doing the only thing that had ever made sense to her. The nightmares got worse. Her return to combat status came with conditions. No deep strike missions, no high-risk operations. She'd be flying support roles, reconnaissance, transport, aerial refueling. The kinds of missions that kept her in the air but away from the sharp edge where people died. Her new squadron commander, a captain named Rodriguez who'd lost pilots before and knew the signs, had delivered the news with careful neutrality. This isn't punishment, Viper. This is the Navy taking care of one of its own. You've earned some time in the shallow end. She'd accepted it without argument. What else could she do? Fight for the right to fly missions that gave her nightmares. Demand they send her back to the places where squadron mates died. She flew her support missions with mechanical competence, got her qualifications updated, kept her mouth shut, became the kind of pilot who was technically excellent and emotionally absent, which in the military often passed for stability. Her call sign changed somewhere in those 18 months. Not officially. The Navy didn't update call signs for psychological reasons, but in the quiet spaces between missions, people stopped calling her Viper, started using a different name. She'd heard it first from a junior pilot who probably didn't realize she was in earshot. That's Iron Widow. Heard she got her whole element killed on some classified op. Just walks around like nothing happened, cold as ice. The name spread. Iron Widow. A call sign born from misunderstanding and rumor and the military's casual cruelty toward anyone who didn't fit the mold. She was a widow because her wingman had died. She was iron because she didn't cry where people could see. The truth was more complicated, it always is, but truth mattered less than perception. By the time she realized the name had stuck, it was too late to fight it. She stopped trying to correct people. Iron Widow was fine. Iron Widow was better than the alternative, better than Viper, which reminded her of who she'd been before everything went wrong. If they wanted to think she was cold and mechanical and emotionally damaged, that was easier than explaining what actually happened in those mountains. Easier than describing what it felt like to leave a man behind, or to hear your wingman's voice cut out forever, or to land on a carrier with someone else's blood on your flight suit. So she became Iron Widow, not because she wanted to, but because the alternative was letting people see how badly she was broken. And then, after 18 months of flying transport missions, and avoiding attention and slowly learning to sleep through the night again, Command had sent her to Admiral Kyne's briefing for the Callion Strait operation. She'd thought it was a mistake. She'd been wrong. Admiral Kyne recovered his composure with the speed of a man used to being surprised. He straightened in his chair, gestured curtly toward an empty seat at the front of the briefing room, and when he spoke again, his voice carried none of its earlier dismissiveness. "Captain Thorne, please join us. I apologize for the confusion." He shot a look at his operations officer that could have melted steel. "I was not properly briefed on your assignment to this operation. Had I known," he stopped himself, shook his head. "My error, take a seat." Vivienne moved through the room in silence. Every eye tracked her progress. The smirking lieutenant from earlier looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. She sat down in the front row, set her helmet carefully on the floor beside her and waited. Didn't offer excuses, didn't explain, just waited for Kyne to continue. The Admiral cleared his throat. For those who don't know the story, and apparently that includes me until 30 seconds ago, Captain Thorne earned her call sign during Operation Smoking Mirror. Classified rescue mission, near-peer adversary, integrated air defense network that had already downed 2 helicopters. She volunteered for a one-way trip, flew through the kind of SAM coverage that should have been suicide, and brought 4 personnel out alive. He paused, and something shifted in his expression. She also lost her wingman in the process, Lieutenant Commander Derek Vance, posthumous Navy Cross. The room had gone completely silent, not the awkward silence from before, but something heavier, more respectful. So when I ask about your call sign, Captain, understand it's not mockery. It's the question I should have asked first. Kine met her eyes directly. What can Iron Widow do for this operation? Vivienne took a breath. This was the moment she'd been dreading and hopping for in equal measure. 18 months of transport missions had felt like penance, like punishment, like purgatory. Now someone was asking her to step back into the fire. Every rational part of her brain screamed to decline, to stick with the safe missions, to protect what little stability she'd managed to rebuild. But rationality had never been her strong suit. Sir, I've reviewed the tactical situation. 3 carrier groups converging on contested airspace. Enemy has deployed S-400 systems on Calayan Island and mobile SAM batteries across the entire northern coast. Our strike packages will face the most sophisticated integrated air defense network outside of Russia or China. Traditional approaches, standoff weapons, stealth aircraft, electronic warfare, will all be partially effective but not decisive. She stood, moved to the tactical display. What you need is someone who can fly through the gaps in their coverage, someone who knows how to thread SAM envelopes at low altitude, someone who's done it before. Kine studied her for a long moment. What you're describing is effectively a suicide mission, again. No, sir, it's a calculated risk mission. There's a difference. Explain. Operation Smoking Mirror failed because we didn't have adequate intelligence on enemy patrol patterns. We were flying blind into a situation where every variable was unknown. This situation is different. We have satellite imagery, signal intelligence, pattern analysis on enemy radar operations. With proper mission planning, I can identify a flight path that keeps aircraft below radar horizon for approximately 70% of the approach. The remaining 30% can be covered with coordinated electronic warfare and decoy drones drawing defensive fire. Admiral Kine leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled under his chin. He had the look of a man doing complex mathematics in his head, calculating risk and reward, weighing one officer's life against strategic objectives, making the kinds of decisions that kept people awake at night long after their stars were won. You understand what you're proposing. You're asking me to authorize a deep penetration strike using tactics that got your wingman killed. You're asking me to trust that 18 months of flying cargo has kept your edge sharp enough for the most dangerous mission profile we've attempted in a decade. His voice wasn't unkind, but it was direct. Help me understand why I should say yes. Vivienne had expected the question, had spent 3 sleepless nights preparing for it. Because the alternative is a conventional strike package that will lose aircraft and pilots to a defensive network we can't fully suppress. S-400 systems have a track record. They're effective against stealth, effective against standoff weapons, and the Calayan Defense Network has been training for exactly this scenario for 6 months. If we go in the expected way, we'll succeed eventually, but at a cost measured in pilots who won't come home. She pulled up a satellite image on the tactical display. But here's what the S-400 can't defend against: an aircraft at 50 feet, using terrain masking, approaching from an attack vector their doctrine says is impossible. They've positioned their radars to cover high-altitude approaches and standoff weapon trajectories. They're optimized for the fight they expect. I'm proposing we give them a different fight. By sending one aircraft into a kill zone designed to destroy entire strike packages. Kine's operations officer spoke for the first time, his voice heavy with skepticism. Even if you make it through, and that's a massive if, what's one Super Hornet going to accomplish against hardened targets? One Super Hornet isn't going to accomplish anything, Captain, but one Super Hornet creating chaos in their defensive network, while the main strike package attacks from a different vector. That changes the entire engagement profile. I'm not asking to win the battle alone. I'm asking to be the distraction that makes the real attack possible. The operations officer opened his mouth to object, but Kine silenced him with a raised hand. You've thought this through. Yes, sir, for 18 months. She said it without bitterness, just stating fact. Every cargo mission I flew, I was thinking about this, running scenarios, studying enemy defensive doctrine, trying to figure out what I would do differently if I had another chance. Another chance at what? The question hung in the air. Vivienne could have deflected it, could have given some tactical answer about mission success rates and strategic objectives. But Kine's eyes told her he was asking something deeper, something about motivation and redemption and all the messy psychological terrain that military doctrine tried to ignore. Another chance to do it right, sir, to bring everyone home. The silence in the briefing room stretched until Kine broke it with a sharp nod. All right, you've got my attention. Let's see your plan. He gestured to the display. Show me how you thread this needle without ending up like Vance. Vivienne had the mission plan loaded on a secure tablet. She pulled it up on the main display, and the room filled with overlapping layers of information: radar coverage zones, terrain elevation data, satellite imagery, threat envelopes. It looked impossibly complex, like trying to navigate through a maze where all the walls could kill you. First, we accept that electronic warfare alone won't work. The S-400 has home-on-jam capabilities. Hit them with active jamming and they'll just fire missiles at the jamming source. So instead, we use passive electronic warfare. Make them think we're somewhere we're not. She highlighted several areas on the map. We deploy a swarm of ADM-160 MALD decoys here, here, and here. Each one has a radar signature identical to a Super Hornet. The enemy's defensive network lights up, starts tracking targets, assigns fire control radars. They think they're seeing a conventional strike package approaching from the east. Kine nodded slowly, and while they're focused on the decoys, I come in from the north, 50 feet off the water, using this island chain for terrain masking. She traced a path through what looked like impossible geography. The S-400 radars are positioned for high-altitude intercepts. Their look-down, shoot-down capability is good, but not perfect, especially if the target is masked by terrain and flying below their optimal engagement envelope. I stay low enough that the Earth's curvature works in my favor. By the time their coastal radars pick me up, I'm already inside their defensive perimeter. And once you're inside, the operations officer had moved closer, studying the map with reluctant interest. I designate primary targets for the main strike package. The S-400 command vehicles are the key nodes. Take those out, and the entire network loses coordination. I'll paint targets with a laser designator, providing real-time targeting data for GPS-guided weapons launched from standoff range. Then I egress using the same route, low and fast, before their backup systems can get organized. The operations officer traced her proposed route with one finger. This valley here, you'd have maybe 20 feet of clearance on either side. At night, in an aircraft loaded with targeting pods and fuel tanks, one wind gust and you hit a ridge. Yes, sir. That's insane. That's the point, sir. They won't expect it because it's insane. She met his eyes, which means it might actually work. Kine was studying her face now, not the map. You've really been planning this for 18 months. Every night, sir, every single night. The Admiral's expression shifted then, something almost like understanding crossing his weathered face. He'd been in the Navy long enough to recognize what he was seeing, someone trying to make peace with ghosts, trying to transform guilt into something useful. It was a pattern he'd seen before in pilots who'd lost wingmen, in commanders who'd lost personnel, in anyone who'd ever given an order that got someone killed. "Captain Thorne, I'm going to ask you something off the record." Kine dismissed his staff with a gesture. Officers filed out reluctantly, curiosity written across their faces. When the door closed, only 3 people remained: Kine, his operations officer, and Vivienne. "Are you volunteering for this mission because it's the best tactical option, or because you're still trying to die for Derek Vance?" The question should have felt invasive, should have triggered anger or defensiveness, or the kind of practice deflection that pilots used when anyone got too close to the truth. Instead, Vivienne felt something unexpected: relief. Relief that someone was finally asking the right question instead of dancing around it. "Sir, I spent 6 months in counseling after smoking mirror. Spent another year flying transport missions and trying to convince myself I was okay. I'm not going to stand here and tell you I'm perfectly healthy, because anyone who volunteers for this kind of mission probably isn't. But I'm also not suicidal." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I'm just trying to make sure that when I do die, and we all die eventually, sir, it means something. Slash died buying time for me to complete the mission. If I spend the rest of my career flying cargo, he died for nothing." "That's not—" "With respect, sir, it is how I see it. I can't bring him back. I can't undo what happened, but I can make sure his sacrifice wasn't wasted. This mission, if we do it right, saves lives. Maybe dozens of lives. Maybe the entire strike package. That's not redemption, sir. That's just math." The operations officer spoke quietly. "Math doesn't usually come with this much personal investment." "No, sir, but effective tactics usually do." Kine exchanged a long look with his operations officer. Some silent communication passed between them, the kind that developed over years of shared operations, shared decisions, shared responsibility for lives spent in service of objectives. Finally, the Admiral turned back to Vivienne. "I'm going to authorize your mission. Against my better judgment, against every instinct that says I'm signing a death warrant, I'm saying yes. Do you know why?" "No, sir." "Because you're right. This is the best tactical option we have. Your plan is sound, your reasoning is solid, and your skills are exactly what this operation needs. But I'm also saying yes because I think you need this. Not in a therapeutic way, I'm not your counselor, but in the way that warriors sometimes need to face the thing that broke them in order to move forward." He stood, extending his hand. "So here's the deal, Captain. You run this mission, you bring yourself home, and afterward we have a conversation about your career trajectory. Because the Navy doesn't need pilots who think they're worthless except when they're flying into danger. We need pilots who remember they have value beyond their tactical utility." Vivienne shook his hand, feeling the firm grip of a man who'd made impossible decisions and lived with them. "Understood, sir." "Do you? Because I'm not sure you do. You've spent 18 months punishing yourself for surviving. That stops after this mission. Win or lose, live or die, you stop treating yourself like you're already dead. Clear?" "Clear, sir." He didn't look entirely convinced, but he nodded anyway. "Good. Mission briefing is tomorrow at 0600. You'll present your tactical plan to the full strike package. Expect questions. Expect pushback. Some of these pilots have been flying combat missions since before you were born, and they're going to be skeptical. You'll need to win them over." "I can handle skepticism, sir." "I know you can. You handled mine." A slight smile. "Dismissed, Captain. Get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be difficult." Vivienne left the briefing room and walked through the carrier's corridors in a daze. The USS Enterprise was a city afloat, 5,000 personnel, enough firepower to level a small country, all contained in a hull of steel and nuclear power. She'd been on carriers before, but this time felt different. This time she wasn't just another pilot. She was the pilot, the one carrying a mission that could reshape the entire operation. Word had apparently traveled fast. Sailors who would normally ignore a passing officer nodded with something like respect. A junior lieutenant actually stepped aside to let her pass, which never happened unless you were an admiral or clearly important. She wondered what version of her story they'd heard. Probably something dramatic and simplified. The hero pilot who flew through hell and brought people home. They wouldn't know about the nightmares. Wouldn't know about the 18 months of cargo missions, or the way her hands still shook sometimes when she strapped into a cockpit. Heroes were always simpler in the stories people told. She found her quarters, a small stateroom she was sharing with another captain, currently empty, and sat on the edge of the rack. Her tablet buzzed with messages, mission files she needed to review, technical specifications for the upgraded targeting systems, weather reports for the Callian Strait, all the mechanical details that transformed theory into reality. She ignored them all and pulled up a different file instead. 1.